when I returned as CEO, which I never had planned to come back, I would say that there were people both on the board at the time and many people at Starbucks, and certainly hundreds of people at Wall Street that said, "You're bringing him back?" I mean, he's the problem.
From NPR, it's How I Built This, a show about innovators, entrepreneurs, idealists, and the stories behind the movements they built. I'm Guy Raz, and on the show today, how a poor kid from the projects in Brooklyn turned a small coffee company in Seattle into the third largest restaurant chain in the world. There was a time in America when a typical coffee experience involved a styrofoam cup at like a PTA meeting or a church social, and it was usually served out of a giant aluminum urn, warming up that coffee for hours and hours, and sometimes there'd be a pink cardboard box of half-eaten glazed donuts next to it. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, consider yourself lucky, because you may not know how hard it was to find good coffee in America before Starbucks. Now, I know some of you are haters. Some of you wouldn't be caught dead in a Starbucks. Too ubiquitous, too corporate. And that's okay, that's totally fine. But just consider for a moment how much coffee culture in America owes to Starbucks and to Howard Schultz. Because if he hadn't stumbled into a little coffee bean and spice shop in Seattle called Starbucks in 1981, it may never have become what it is today. Now, at the time, Starbucks was just a local chain in Seattle, and it didn't sell brewed coffee, just the beans. But Howard was so blown away by the quality of the coffee he tasted from those beans that he quit his job and begged the owners of Starbucks to hire him. Then 6 years later, when those same owners decided to sell, Howard raised the money to buy the company. And just a few years after that, he took Starbucks national. Now today, there are 27,000 Starbucks locations in roughly 70 countries around the world, which isn't bad for a kid who grew up poor in Brooklyn. A couple weeks ago in Seattle, I sat down with Howard in front of a live audience to hear about how he took that Seattle coffee bean shop and turned it into the Starbucks we know today.
Thank you very much.
They didn't think you would be here. That's why they cheered so loud. They could not believe you walked out. They were just amazed. By the way, how many cups of coffee do you drink every day?
Probably 4 or 5 a day.
4 or 5 a day?
Yeah, and no caffeine after 5 p.m.
Fair enough. And what is your preferred coffee drink?
French press of aged Sumatra would be my number one choice.
All right, okay, good.
Must be a lot of Starbucks people here.
A lot of people know that you were raised in a housing project, Bayview in Brooklyn. Can you describe the apartment that you grew up in?
Sure. I grew up in Canarsie, which is at the last stop of the L train in Brooklyn, in a housing project that had 34 buildings, 2-bedroom apartment for my mother and father, sister and brother. I think the rent in 1956 was $96 a month.
Wow.
Yeah.
Who are the people who lived there?
Who lived there were people who were construction workers, cab drivers, plumbers, and it was a childhood that was based on a real sense of community because there were people with like-minded values, and it was a very diverse group of people. And I think at an early age, I learned how to get along with a lot of different people because we were in one building with one elevator, and you had to get along.
Yeah. Your dad, World War II vet.
Yes.
He was a driver. Mom, receptionist. I guess at a certain point when you were a kid, your dad got injured on the job.
So my dad had a series of what I would loosely describe as really bad blue-collar jobs. And he went from one job to another. In the winter month of March of 1960, he was a delivery driver. This is probably one of his worst jobs. picking up and delivering cloth diapers before the invention of Pampers. He fell on a sheet of ice and broke his hip and his leg. And I came home from school and he was kind of laid out on the couch. I witnessed what I would loosely describe as the fracturing of the American dream. And despair, hopelessness. And what happened in 1960, if you were a blue-collar, uneducated worker, despite the fact that you had served your country in World War II, there was no workman's compensation, there was no health care, and you were dismissed. But what I witnessed scarred me, and that's what we kind of went through.
Were you a good student as a kid?
I was not a good student. I don't think I applied myself very well.
But an athlete. You were an athlete.
I was an athlete. I was
and a pretty good athlete.
Yeah. I was an athlete because in the projects, the entire day was spent in the schoolyard, on concrete schoolyard, playing any sport that you could invent or organize. You would dive on concrete to win. And so my competitiveness, I think, was born out of being that kid in that schoolyard. I became a very good high school football player.
Which is so weird to think about because you're a pretty trim guy, right? I mean, you're not like a big, huge, hulking, burly guy, right? But football was your sport, and you were like very good. I mean, you were recruited by a Division II school.
But I was a fast white guy.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So you are recruited by Northern Michigan University to go play football there, and did you think that? I mean, did you think that there was any possibility you might go to the
No.
I
never thought I was going to be good enough. And in fact, when I got to Northern Michigan and I saw the size of these guys, and real Midwestern grit, the toughness and the competitiveness of what I experienced in the schoolyard started drifting.
Did you get any playing time?
No, I got hurt right away. I know it sounds funny, but at the time, and here's the thing, a very famous guy was ahead of me in my position, and that was Steve Mariucci. He was a great player, became the coach of the San Francisco 49ers, and he was much better.
So football was not in the cards. You were not going to
No.
play professional, so you had to go out and get a job after you graduate. What do you do?
I was very fortunate that when I finished school, I somehow convinced people at Xerox to hire me.
What do you mean you convinced them?
Well, I really had no training. I did not have a business degree. I had a communications degree from Northern Michigan. But I got a sales job at Xerox. This was 1976. And at Xerox, first I sent you to a sales training school in Leesburg, Virginia. And after that, for 6 months, all you do is make 50 cold calls a day.
Oof.
But I'm not talking out on a phone. You have to go make a physical cold call into an office.
And this is in New York or in
It's in New York City. My territory was 42nd to 48th from Fifth Avenue to the river.
You just had to go door to door, office to office,
every day.
knock on the door, and
Yeah.
and most of them were just saying no solicitors, please, not
Yeah,
interested.
and if you got a lead, you were not yet allowed to sell the product. You had to give it. You were an intern basically. You had to give it to the salesperson. And my salary in 1976, I tell my kids this, and they go, "That's not true." Was $1,000 a month, and I gave half of it to my mother because I was living at home.
Yeah. Wow. So were you good at cold calling? And
I was really good. I was really.
you liked getting
Well, I mean,
rejected
I
constantly?
didn't like cold calling, but once I became a salesperson at Xerox, it was clear to the people at Xerox that I had some talent, and I stayed there a number of years. But all along, I knew that the discipline, the regimentation, the lack of kind of personal creativity, I was very restless, and I was looking for a way out. So it wasn't joyful. I wasn't happy.
It's interesting because a lot of people we've had on the show, like Sarah Blakely, who started Spanx, started out, selling things door to door.
Yeah.
Do you think that was an important?
I do, because I think the rejection of cold calling, the humility that comes with the disappointment of not someone saying yes to you. I went through a steep learning curve and I started having a higher level of self-esteem. Xerox and IBM at that point in the mid-70s were two kind of pedigree companies that if you told somebody you're working for Xerox, people felt kind of good about you, until I told my mother I was leaving Xerox. And she started crying. But I knew in my heart early on that I had an entrepreneurial zest for something different, and was looking for a different kind of opportunity.
So what'd you find?
So I left Xerox because a friend of mine shared with me that there was a Swedish company opening an office in New York and looking for a general manager. And I had no idea what the product really was. Met the person who was in charge of moving from Sweden to New York, and he and I made an immediate connection, and he became a lifelong friend and mentor to me and hired me. And his name was Kai Eliasson.
And what were you selling?
At first, they were opening up a division for furniture, and I had to move to North Carolina for a year while Sherry and I were dating in New York.
You had met Sherry around this time? Sherry, who's now your wife?
Yeah, Sherry and I met in 1978 on July 4th, and this was 1980 or so. North Carolina was not for me. And so I went to Kai and I said, I want to come back to New York or I'm going to leave the company. And he said, let me kind of think about all of this, let me figure out what to do. And he gave me the general manager job of the consumer division in New York. And unbeknownst to me, on a trip to San Francisco to see our largest customer, which was Macy's at the time, on the way back from California, I stopped in Seattle because there was a small coffee company called Starbucks selling this product. And it was a non-electric kind of thermos coffee maker. And I walked into the Pike Place store and I just said, holy shit. I literally had the kind of epiphany that just spoke to me that this is such an extraordinary thing about what they were doing. And the coffee, the romance, the passion that people had. And I met the founders, and over a course of a year, I persuaded them to hire me.
Here's what I don't get. What was it? I mean, they were selling coffee beans, which is, which is really cool.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you had this really great job in an apartment in New York, and what made you think, I have got to drop everything and sell coffee beans? Well,
there's two things going on. I think Sherry and I, we had an understanding that we did not want to raise our kids in New York City. We wanted to get out. And I was in Seattle on this spectacular, majestic day like today. So the combination of all of that and the experience I had as a customer and watching what was going on in that first store, I just immediately was kind of swept away with, this is the kind of environment, product, and young company I'd like to be part of. And I, over a course of a year, just kept banging the door to say to the founders, if you expand the company, I think I can help you. And their dream, and nothing against them, their dream at the time was to expand to Portland, Oregon. That was their big idea.
And was that, I mean, part of your vision for the company at the time? Did you think we can expand and continue to sell coffee beans?
Yeah. I think I had to learn the business, so I didn't know anything different at that time until I went to Italy a year later in 1983.
And by the way, were you a coffee drinker? I mean, did you know anything about coffee at that point?
I was a coffee drinker, but I did not know much about coffee.
It's like Maxwell House and whatever?
Well, a little bit better than that.
All right. Sorry.
Come on.
So you knew something about coffee.
So I knew enough that I had a great appreciation for the coffee I tasted for the first time at the original Pike Place store, and I was just blown away. We had 4 stores at the time, and then the founder sent me to Milan, Italy, first trip for me to Italy, to a trade show representing Starbucks. And that's when I was walking the streets of Milan. And every 20, 30 yards, you are intercepted, literally, with a Italian coffee bar. And I walked into all of these places and kept seeing the theater, the romance, and the nectar of the gods, which is espresso.
Those like big sort of copper espresso.
All the elegance, the style. But what really struck me was the sense of community. And I started going to these stores almost the same time every day, and I would start seeing the same people. I started realizing that this is a third place between home and work, but the beverage was the draw. And so I realized while I was in Italy that Starbucks was in the coffee business, but perhaps the wrong part of the business. And I raced back with such enthusiasm and such passion that I overwhelmed them when I got back.
You said, we have got to do this. We got to sell brewed coffee, because they were not selling brewed coffee.
Yeah. No, there was no service of any cup of coffee at any Starbucks. It was just pounds of coffee for home use.
And you come back to Seattle and you say, guys, we have got to do this. It's going to be huge. And they say?
No. They viewed the beverage business in their parlance as being in the restaurant business. Mm-hmm. And they didn't like it. They thought it was messy, and that's not what they wanted to do. So I literally pounded on the table for a year. And I think they just said, okay, get this kid out of our face. And we're opening a new store on the corner of 4th and Spring in 1985. It was 1,500 square feet, and they said, we'll give you 500 feet of the 1,500 to open up an Italian coffee bar in the store. And that was it. I mean, so we opened the 4th and Spring Starbucks store with the first coffee bar. Overnight, we had hundreds of customers every day, and we introduced Cafe Latte to the city of Seattle, basically. Now, here's the rub. It was so successful that it completely dwarfed the other side of the business. And the two founders at the time did not like the disproportionate level of sales and how the store was functioning. And they respectfully said to me, we don't want to repeat this. And I was crushed. I was thinking, how could you possibly, look what's going on here. Not to mention, we're making more money.
Yeah.
I was devastated. I almost didn't believe it at first. I said, are you serious? And so I think Sherry knew I was depressed, and I came home one night and said, I don't think I can work for anyone anymore. I'm leaving Starbucks. I'm going to start my own. So I told the two founders what I was doing, and then they surprised me and said, well, if you do that, we'd like to invest in you.
Which is pretty cool. Yeah.
But here's the rub. But of course you're going to use Starbucks coffee.
Right.
But they invested and kind of gave me legitimacy to open up an Italian coffee bar in the Columbia Center Tower when the building opened. I signed that lease with a developer in Seattle, a very famous guy here locally called Martin Selig. It was 700 square feet, and he asked me for a personal guarantee. I said, sure, I have no problem with that.
And by the way, you're like 32 years old.
And we had nothing.
Yeah.
So
okay.
He wanted a personal guarantee. I guaranteed it, but knew there was nothing behind it. And we opened the store called Il Giornale. I went back to Italy. I did a lot more research. I spent a lot more time there. And I named the company after the Italian newspaper in Milan. And we opened 2 stores in Seattle. And then there was a great location in Vancouver, BC. And we said, sure, let's open in Vancouver. So we opened 3 stores. We were raising money to do that, by the way.
Yeah, how did you do that? I mean, were people sort of saying, yeah, of course I wanted Howard Schultz. Oh my gosh, future genius CEO, please take my money. Was it really easy to get that money?
No. The truth of the matter is that I spoke to 242 people to try and raise $1,700,000 to form Il Giornale. And Starbucks was a seed investor, but did not give me enough money to open up a store. And Starbucks put a little contract in there, which was, you have to raise $600,000 to use our 200. So I went out and tried to raise money and was having a very hard time. It reminded me of cold calling, a lot of rejection. Because I remember people said, well, let me try and understand this. The name of the company is a name no one can pronounce. You're going to sell coffee for $2 to $3 a cup of coffee in a paper cup with Italian names that no one's ever heard of. And you want to give health care to your employees. And so it was a tough sell. Now, our first investor is in this audience. Her name is Carol Bobo.
Wow.
I don't know where she is.
Wow. Carol, that was a good move. Good move.
And Carol was Sherry's dearest friend. And we went over to their house. I had the business plan, I had the pitch and everything. And Carol and her husband said, we don't need any pitch. We're just going to trust you. Wow. And they wrote a check that night and gave me $100,000. And, and things started happening after that.
What was your ambition for Il Giornale? I mean, did you think this is going to be a national chain of coffee bars?
Well, here's an interesting story. So the original business plan was 100 stores. And we weren't raising any money because people didn't believe we could open 100 stores. And I didn't even have enough funds, resources, to kind of professionally reprint the document. So I figured out a way to kind of white out the 100. And I wrote 75. So we opened our first store in 86. And then a year after, Jerry, the founder of Starbucks, had acquired Peet's Coffee Company. Many people don't realize that Peet's and Starbucks were one company 2 years prior to that. And Jerry came to me and
Jerry
Baldwin came to me and said, we've run into some financial trouble. And we're going to have to split the two companies. And I've decided I'm going to move to California, and I want to keep Peet's. The person who should buy Starbucks is you. And so the price is one-time sales, 6 stores, $3.8 million, which was, it was fantastic news.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a 90-day exclusive to try and come back to me with $3.8 million. So I was extraordinarily excited, but I didn't know where I was going to get the money.
Right. Yeah.
And so now we had to go back out and raise money. And it was very difficult.
So how did you do it?
We went back to the original investors of Il Giornale. Some of them were interested, but a lot of them weren't. Because Il Giornale had 3 stores. We didn't prove anything.
Yeah.
So, Jerry kept checking in with me to see how are you doing on the fundraising, and about 60 days in, I said, we're about halfway there, and I'm confident that we'll get to $3.8 million. And he said, I have to sit down and tell you something. We have a competitive buyer. And I said, Jerry, you told me we had an exclusive. What do you mean? And he said, one of your investors from Il Giornale has shown up and offered me $4 million cash with no due diligence. And I was like, I can remember that moment as if the world had just ended, because I knew who it was, he told me, and the person at the time, there were 3 business titans in Seattle, and he was one of them. And they had invested in Il Giornale as a group. I didn't know what to do, and Jerry said, I will hold for 90 days, but you have to know, on the 90th day, I have to sell.
Wow.
2 or 3 days later, I'm playing basketball, and a friend of mine who was my young attorney at the time, Scott Greenberg, I tell him the story that night after the game. And him trying to help me as a friend and as a lawyer says, you need to come to the office tomorrow morning and meet our senior partner and tell him the story. I didn't know who the senior partner was. I didn't know anything. So I go to the office the following morning at 8 a.m., and he takes me into the office to meet Bill Gates Sr. I walked in the office with Scott, and Bill Gates Sr. said, tell me the entire story. And I'm taking it to him chapter and verse like I am with you, with more detail. And he's writing down. And I finish, and he said, Howard, We don't know each other. I'm just going to ask you this question one time. Is everything you told me true? And I said, it's 100% truthful. And he says to me, we're going to take a walk. And I said, where are we going? and he says, we're going to see the man. My heart was racing with such anxiety, trepidation.
He's taking you to see this guy.
Yeah, I'm not saying the name, but he's taking me to see the competitive buyer. So 10 minutes later, we walk across the street, go up the office building, and we walk into this man's office. Now, Bill Gates is 6'7", and in the mid-'80s, he was in his prime, and he was a force. And we walked in that office, and all I remember him saying is, you should be ashamed of yourself, that you're going to steal this kid's dream. It's not going to happen. You and I both know this is not going to happen. And within 10 minutes, he told them to stand down. We're walking out of this office, and this kid's buying this company.
In just a moment, Howard Schultz explains how Starbucks spread from Seattle to the East Coast and then all around the world. Stay with us. I'm Guy Raz, and you're listening to How I Built This, recorded live in Seattle. Support for this NPR podcast comes from American Express Open. We know that listeners to How I Built This are curious about how good ideas become great businesses. And chances are you have some good ideas of your own, but as you know, in business, there can be a lot of roadblocks. American Express Open knows how hard it can be to get things done, and they want to help with money and know-how so you can turn those ideas into action. Visit open.com to get business done.